Hello and welcome to part 3 in the material creation tutorial series. So in this one what we're going to do, we're going to take this example scene here and we're going to take the concepts we learned in the previous 2 lessons and we're going to apply them to setting up the materials in this scene. So let's go ahead and get started here, and let's start with the book. So with the book, let's go ahead and create a leather texture, and I want to show you a very interesting trick that I like to do when I'm trying to focus in on a certain area. I'll press Control Alt and I'll right click on that, which is going to center my camera's orbit point around the point that I clicked on. So that allows me to easily zoom in exactly on the area that I'm trying to focus on. So now that we're in here and we can see what's going on, let's double click on that material and you can see it's the plastic material type. As far as the specular, I think this is pretty good for a leather-bound book material. And the roughness is probably pretty good too. I don't think we certainly don't want it perfectly polished. So we'll start with something like that. Looks pretty decent. And let's go over to the textures menu and let's load in a color texture. Okay, so I do have a leather here. Go ahead and grab that. And let's also go into performance mode. So we'll press Alt-P, and that's going to turn off all the detailed shadows, and it's going to allow us to get a better look at our texture and give us a better idea of what's happening as we tune things like the scale. We'll be able to see it a lot more clearly. Now if you look here, we can see we do have some texture projection issues. The UV coordinates projection mode is not going to work in this particular case. So I'm going to go ahead and switch this to box map, which is going to work in most instances. If you're ever having texture issues and your textures are looking stretched or skewed or distorted in some sort of way, you'll probably want to try switching it over to box map. So let's go ahead and reduce the scale of this. And we'll get to a point that we like, and I think that's looking pretty good. And let's go ahead and load in the same texture as a bump map. Now if you wanted to go a little bit further on the bump map, what you could do is pull in this leather texture and you would essentially isolate all the little valleys in the leather grain, and you would fill those with, say, like a black, and then everything else would be almost a mid-gray or a white, and that way you'd be creating the bump exactly in those little valleys. But if you're not sure how to go about that, or you're in a hurry, you can always load the same texture as your bump map and it's still going to give you a better result than if you didn't have one. Now this is also set to UV coordinates, so what we're going to want to do is change that to box map so it matches with this one. And let's turn on sync, because we have 2 maps that are working together that are designed to be in correct alignment with each other. So now with the sync box checked, if I reduce the scale down, it's going to affect both of those. So now that we do have the bump applied, this book feels a bit too matte for what I was hoping to achieve. So we can always go back to the Properties tab and we can start to reduce this roughness down to get a little bit more shine on there. And we may also want to go back to the Bump tab and turn this bump height down a little bit. So when you're setting up your materials, once you do add a bump map, you'll probably want to do a little back and forth between tuning your roughness, tuning your bump height until you get the look you're going for. Okay, so we have a nice highlight starting at the corner and rolling off towards the front, and I'm pretty happy with that for now, so we'll go ahead and keep that. Next thing I want to do is let's work on these pages. Now there's a very cool and simple trick that we can use to create the look of actual pages on this book. So let's go ahead and load in a normal map. A normal map is just a different type of bump map, and I'll show you how to identify those. So under the textures, I'm just going to go ahead and go to bump, and I'm going to look in the KeyShot 3 folder because there's a specific texture that I know of that ships with KeyShot 3 that we'll be using to create this effect. Okay, so let's scroll down to textures. looking for is horizontal normal. There we go, horizontal tubes. So we'll load that. And you see how the color of this image is, these purples and these blues. You'll see quite a few of those in the KeyShot texture library. Like you look at all these. These are normal maps. They're a little bit different than your standard bump map. Whereas a standard bump map uses black and white values to determine areas that are raised and lowered. These have more color information, and that color information essentially translates into X, Y, and Z coordinates. So it's a little bit more in depth, so to speak, than just straight up raised or lowered. So, but the main thing to take from that is if you are using this, you'll want to go ahead and make sure that it is set to normal map mode. See, now that we've enabled normal map mode, we can see the effect of that. Okay, and you can see we do have some texture issues there. So what we're going to want to do is change that to box map as well. But now the scale is a bit too much. So what we'll want to do is start to reduce that down. And now we've created a pretty good look of pages. Okay, and let's turn off performance mode and see what we're ending up with. So I did that by pressing Alt-P. We'll let that res up. Okay, so moving on, let's talk about doing something like fabric. So I'll also go back into performance mode, and let's double click on this piece of fabric, and what we're going to do is we are going to use the plastic material type. So again, just want to reinforce that the plastic material type is very versatile and can do more than just plastics. So if we're doing something like fabric, we know that fabric isn't reflective, so we'll probably either want to turn the specular all the way down, or if we have specular applied, we'll want to make sure that our roughness is up to the point where the specular reflections aren't very sharp or sharp at all. So let's go ahead and load in just a texture. Okay, so I do have this fabric texture here, and I'm also going to load that into the bump. Okay, so you can see now we have that little bit more of an effect going on there, a little bit more depth in our material. So now let's also make sure that sync is enabled, and that way the color and the bump are going to stay aligned when we reduce the scale here. Okay, let's take a look at something else here. If we look at this, you can see this texture is kind of blown out in this area. So whenever you do have a texture applied to a material, there are some additional controls that you have over tuning that texture. And let me go ahead and show you what those are. Under the Properties tab, now that I have texture enabled, I have a few more options, and that's Blend with Color. So if I wanted to color this a certain other way, I could set a color there, and it's going to allow me to edit that, and that will blend with the actual texture color. Okay. The other thing you can do is you can reduce the brightness, and you can up the contrast, which in this case I would like to up the contrast to get a little bit more of an apparent sort of woven pattern in there. So you can see just with some simple texturing, it's pretty easy to create something like fabric. It also depends on the model. This particular model, has this drapery effect, and that really does help create the look of realistic fabric. Let's turn off performance mode for a second because I want to show you one other thing. If you look under here, the fabric is completely in shadow underneath the table. Okay, now if this were real fabric, you would have light from this window hitting here, and it would probably shine through on that portion, and this wouldn't be purely dark under here because you'd have light scattering underneath there. There is a parameter with the plastic material that you can tune to create that effect. If you look here under the advanced parameters, there's an option called diffuse transmission. If we click diffuse transmission and we set a dark color of what our actual fabric is, watch what happens. If you take a look in there, you can see that we're starting to get, some of that light shining through. And essentially, whatever color you set for your diffuse transmission, that's what color it's going to simulate, passing through that material. But what you'll probably want to do is just set a very similar color to what your actual fabric is. And the brighter you go with this, the more the light is going to appear to pass through that. Okay. So let's do something else. Let's take a look at this, and let's look at our textures, and let's go ahead and load in an opacity map and create an even more interesting fabric pattern here. So I have this fabric alpha, and the opacity map is going to use black and white values to essentially cut shapes out of this material, sort of like a stencil. So I have that loaded, and let's adjust our scale and start to reduce this down. And let's zoom in there and see what we actually have. Let that res up, and you can see we have a pretty interesting fabric pattern there. Very detailed, has a nice woven pattern to it that was pretty easy to create simply by using textures. Okay. So now that we have that, actually let me go ahead and just reduce that scale a little bit more. Let's go ahead and hide this part. So I'll right click on it and select hide part. And now let's go ahead and work on this table material. Okay, so what if we wanted to create this out of wood? I'm going to go ahead and stick with the plastic material type. And let's say, for example, that this was just made out of something cheap like plywood. So I do have this plywood texture here. And all we would want to do for that is really just kind of, make sure that you would want some specular so you can get some light roll on there. But also you'd want to turn up that roughness to the point where those reflections are really broken up. And again, you can come back in here and you can darken your texture. You can add contrast to your texture if you want a little bit more of a vibrance and contrasty look to it. And you can see that was pretty easy to create a plywood material. Let's switch this to something like a fine wood. So we're going to essentially keep most of the same settings. All we're really going to do is switch out the texture, adjust our roughness and our specular color a little bit, and we're going to have a different material altogether. So there's our fine wood. I think our scale is a bit small on there. I'd like to see some larger grain pattern. So I'll start to increase that. Okay. So there we got some decent grain going on. And instead of making this appear matte, I'd like it to appear as if it had a clear coat finish on top of it. So what we can do is drop this roughness down. And now we have a polished table. And you can add subtle amounts of roughness too if you want to break up those reflections ever so slightly. Okay, let's go ahead and undo hide part. And so there's our tablecloth sitting on top of our wood table. And let's move on here and let's work on the basket. So I'm going to press Control-Alt, right-click. That's going to position my camera around that point. And now if I zoom in, I can get right into the area where I'm trying to work. The other thing I'm going to do is press Alt-P, put us into performance mode. And let's set this material here to something like a wicker basket material. So I'm going to stick with the plastic. Going to load in a wicker texture here. In this particular case, UV coordinates is actually working pretty well. For this shape object, if UV coordinates wasn't working, a good one to try might be cylindrical. So let's also load this in on the bump channel. So there it is. And let's ensure that sync is checked. Now if we increase this bump height, we should get a little bit more of that illusion of depth. Now one thing I don't like how elongated this texture is horizontally. So I'm going to expand the scale parameters and I'm going to start to shrink this on the X. Now that I have that proportional, if I collapse the scale parameter and increase or decrease this, it should go together. Okay, so there we go. Now, let's turn off performance mode and take a look at our scene. Okay, now what if we wanted to make this a metal trim? Maybe this is, some sort of silver or copper or gold. Very, very easy to do. And the way I would suggest doing that is just double click on that material, change the type from advanced to a metal, and there you go. There it is with a sort of a polished metal, and you can tune the color. So if we wanted that to be copper, we could take this over into the copper range. If we wanted it to be gold, we could take it more into the yellow range. But I think we'll go ahead and stick with a silver type material here. And the other thing I'd like to do is probably add a little bit of roughness to this. So that's going to start to break up those reflections. Okay, and let's go ahead and just save our scene. All right, moving on. Let's take a look at the translucent material. Very, very interesting material type. And we're going to use it on the grapes here because grapes, they're an interesting material in that they're not transparent, but light does pass through them. And they have a very unique look because light does pass through them. And that look is described as translucent. So let's double click on here and we'll start to create that look. Look here how they almost, they don't feel soft. They feel like they're made of some sort of clay or some sort of just hard material. They don't feel like soft grapes. Now, you'll notice when we switch this to the translucent material and start tuning it, that's what's actually going to make it look and feel soft. So we'll change this from plastic to translucent, and we'll let that sit for a second just to see what we end up with. They do feel a bit softer than before, but we're still not quite getting the look of realistic grapes. And the reason is this subsurface color. What we want to do is we want to set our grapes diffuse color, or the surface color. We want to set this to something like a deep sort of green. And I know that's not the color of actual grapes, but when we start to introduce the correct subsurface color, that's going to brighten up this material overall, and there's going to be a nice average between those two. That's going to end up looking pretty decent. So what we'll do is we'll start to introduce some green, yellowish green bright light for our subsurface color. Let's press OK, and let's see how that starts to look. Okay, still not entirely convinced, so let's go to our surface color, and maybe we do want to brighten that up a little bit. And maybe another thing we'd like to do is increase this translucency. This translucency is going to increase the effect of this subsurface color. we're starting to get something that feels like soft grapes. See, if you look at this, you can really tell that light is hitting on this surface and then it's scattering beneath it, and you can see sort of these edge glows and things going on, and that's a direct effect of translucency. We could also reduce or increase the roughness on these. More than likely, I don't think we would have grapes that are that perfectly polished, so probably want to increase that. And for now, let's go ahead and stick with that. We may tune that later, but let's not get too hung up here. And let's move on to these apples. So for the apples, there is already a texture created for these. And if I load that in, it's very simple to create a look of a realistic apple. This texture could easily be created by simply photographing a couple different sides of an apple and stitching this together inside Photoshop. One thing we need to do is mess with the scale of this, because the top edge of the texture is right here around the just above the midsection of the apple. What we want is for this to be up by the stem. So if we expand our scale parameter, let's adjust this on the Y until that gets up where it needs to be. And the other thing you could do is, work with that contrast or the brightness of this texture if you wanted to control that even more. But I think, it looks pretty good right there. And let's let that sit for a second and see what we end up with. Okay, things are starting to come together here. So, and as far as the leaves, I'd probably go ahead and stick with the translucent, and I do already have a texture applied here. And it is just a simple leaf texture. So we'll keep that where it is. And all I have is a little bit of subsurface color. So let's maybe set that to a yellowish green, and increase the translucency. Okay, so let's zoom out here and take a look at our scene so far. Let that sit for a second, see where we stand. It's definitely starting to come together. And we have essentially one more main part to do back here, and that's this skull. So let's double click on that, and what we're going to want to do here again is use the translucent material type. So let's change this from plastic to translucent, and what I want to do with this is set sort of a pale yellowish, almost mid-gray sort of color for the surface, because again, even though a bone might be a little bit brighter than this, our subsurface color is also going to affect the overall brightness of this material. So once we start to introduce a brighter color here, the whole thing is going to start to overall appear brighter. Now bone starts to get a little bit of yellowish, warm, sometimes more in the red range of colored light passing through it due to what's on the inside of it. So let's set that, and let's also turn up our translucency a little bit and see what we end up with. So you can see in there in the thinner portions, we're starting to see where the light's passing through, and that's how translucency does work. When you have something that is translucent that scatters light beneath the surface, that light is going to be more apparent in the thinner areas. See up top where it's thicker, we're not seeing as much of that scattered light. And that's because this material, it does work off of scale. It can essentially tell when it has two surfaces, a certain distance from each other. So if you look here at the septum, where you have these two surfaces that are thin right next to each other, more light's going to pass through there because KeyShot knows that these are not very far apart, versus when you look at the surfaces on either sides of the skull. The surface on this side is much further away from the surface on the other side than it is in this area of the nose. And so you'll see more of that translucent effect in that area. Let's shift this over into the red range a little bit more. I feel like it's a bit too yellow. So we'll go almost reddish brown. And see what we end up with. Maybe we want to turn up our translucency a little bit more. See, we're really starting to get that effect in there. Okay, the other thing that I'd probably like to do here, if you look at this skull, it's awfully perfect. There's no real deviation in the texture. It's just a solid tone, solid color. One thing we can do to sort of break that up a bit is we can try and add sort of a noise texture to this. So let's go to the KeyShot 3 folder and let's look in our textures. Okay, here's a noise texture that I have, and let's apply that on there. And what that's going to do is that's going to start to add some variation in there. And we look there, we can see that that adds just a subtle amount, a little bit more interest in variation. And of course, you could change the mapping type to something like box map. And the interesting thing there is it does create a little seam on this side and adds a little bit more visual interest to this material. And you could always check the blend with color, and maybe we brighten this up a little bit more. Okay, so let's frame our shot, but before we do, I think I'm just going to go ahead and go over to this fabric, and I'm going to get rid of that opacity map. I'd rather just see the fabric as a solid cloth. And let's get our shot framed. Now, we are using the Luxion Conference Room HDR for this, and there's some things in this conference room that we can really use to our advantage, like this picture on the wall and this flower pot back here. And if we start to zoom in, frame our shot, let's see what we can do to include those elements in our final image. So let's open up the project window and we'll go to the camera tab. And what I'd like to do, first of all, is I want to start to adjust my focal length. What I'd like to simulate here is my camera being pulled back and essentially using a zoom lens to zoom into this scene here. So the way to go about that is by adjusting this focal length. Now the higher this number, the more of a zoom lens you're having. So when I'm doing this, I'm not actually moving the camera forward physically. The camera's staying physically in the same position, but what you're doing is simulating the effect of a zoom lens, which does have a different appearance than if you physically moved the camera forward. Okay, so let's frame our shot. And we do have that picture in the flower pot back there. Let me show you what we can do. We can go to the environment tab and we can reduce the size of this environment, and we can also adjust the height. until we get something we like. And the next thing that we're going to do to really set this shot up nice is we're going to turn on depth of field so that we do kind of blur out that background and focus in on this particular scene here. So turn on depth of field, and once I do that, you can see everything got blurred out. So what I want to do is click this select focus point. We'll click on the fruit basket there, and if I start to increase this f-stop value, I'll get less blur. So I can try and bring the skull back into focus and keep the background still blurred out. So the higher the number, the less blur you'll have. The lower the number, the more blur you have. Okay, so that's a look at material creation in KeyShot. Hopefully that gives you all an idea of how easy it is to create different material types and how versatile the plastic type is. Simply by using different textures and by adjusting things like your roughness and your specular color, you can create a wide range of materials. Thank you. Hope you enjoyed it.